The history of West Point began in 1778 when Tadeusz Kosciuszko, a Polish engineer, was hired to design and build fortifications on the plateau of the west bank of the Hudson River. To keep the British from sending ships up this river, the Continental Army built forts and gun batteries on both sides of the river. They also installed a 65-ton iron chain that was stretched across the river to block any British invasion. Having recognized the need for professional military officers, the United States Military Academy was established at West Point in 1802. Although West Point only graduated 52 officers during its first 10 years of operation, the Army's growing need for officers forced the Academy to begin building new barracks in 1815. Built of textured granite, the North Barracks included towers and brooding gargoyles that watched over the cadets as they marched through the large wooden doors of the dormitory to and from their classes. The new building was characterized by wrought iron windows and triangular stone arches. Under the leadership of the Academy's first superintendent, Major Sylvanus Thayer, students were instilled with the precepts of duty, honor, and country, all of which are lessons that remain an integral part of the Academy's moral code. In addition to learning military discipline and leadership, cadets were taught the science of warfare, which included the use of weapons, tactics, and strategy. They also learned both civil and military engineering. As a matter of academic trivia, West Point was the first engineering college to have been founded in the United States. Since Major Sylvanus Thayer was himself an engineer, all of the graduating students during his tenure as superintendent were trained as both officers as well as engineers. As such, these officers were in high demand in the civilian sector as surveyors and as civil engineers. Throughout the 19th century, Academy graduates were largely responsible for the construction of the country's earliest waterways, such as the Erie Canal. Surveying and construction for this canal began in 1817. By the time the project was completed in 1825, the canal would stretch 363 miles to connect the cities of Albany and Buffalo. Military engineers built lighthouses, mapped out navigation channels, and built jetties and piers for major harbors. In 1853, men from the Army Corps of Engineers began surveying four different east-to-west routes for what would later become the Transcontinental Railroad. It was a West Point graduate, Colonel George Goethals from the class of 1880, who supervised the construction of the Panama Canal, starting in 1903. This construction project would take 10 years to complete. Once completed, it would allow ships a quick transit from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans. During the Mexican-American War, which was fought between 1846 and 1848, 3/4 of the line officers were West Point graduates. Nearly all of the officers in the Adjutant General, Quartermaster, and Ordnance departments were also West Point graduates, as were the officers of the Engineering Corps and the topographical engineers. The American Army was quite small back then, and only numbered 35,000 men. During the American Civil War, West Point graduates led armies on both sides of the conflict. On the Union side were officers like Ulysses S. Grant, William Tecumseh Sherman, and George Armstrong Custer. On the Confederate side were officers like Robert E. Lee, John Bell Hood, and George Pickett. Although West Point remains an important source of officers for the United States Army, as this country has grown, the Army's need for officers has also grown. Today's all-volunteer Army numbers 1.4 million personnel, making it the world's third-largest army. Only China and Russia have larger armies. Most of the Army's need for officers has been supplied through reserve officer training programs at colleges throughout the country. 70% of today's officers are from ROTC training programs, while only 30% of all Army officers are graduates of West Point. Since West Point is the country's oldest continually occupied military post, it will likely surprise no one, other than paranormal skeptics, that West Point is haunted. According to the Academy's own records, the first known report of ghosts date back to 1972. According to Academy archivists, at 2 a.m. on a chilly October morning in 1972, the ghost of a middle-aged soldier appeared before a cadet in room 4714 of the Old North Barracks. The soldier is said to have had shining eyes of light. It wore an outdated uniform from the 1830s, had a handlebar mustache, wore a shako, and carried a musket. When a cadet awoke to see a ghost standing before him, his screams awoke his roommate. By the time his roommate was awake, the ghost had vanished. Over the next month, this apparition would be seen by several other cadets. At one time it appeared in a part of the barracks known as the Bureau. Having appeared among a group of cadets, the students screamed and recoiled at the sight of the menacing phantom. The ghostly figure walked amongst them prior to fading from sight. According to the New York Times, this ghost has been seen drifting in the dead of night, in and out of stone masonry walls and metal lockers on the ground floor of the North Barracks. In time, room 4714 was temporarily placed off limits due to the number of cadets who wanted to spend the night at this location. Since the company commander thought that this apparition had created too many distractions, the two plebes who had occupied this room were transferred to an alternate residence. 4714 was eventually converted to a study room. Following the conversion of this room, this particular ghost was not seen again. Another haunted location at West Point is the superintendent's house. Known as the Maxwell Mansion, the superintendent's house is said to be haunted by at least two ghosts. According to a séance that was held at this house in 1972, at the behest of the then superintendent, Lieutenant General William A. Knowlton, two clairvoyants named Eric and Lorraine Warren visited the house. Lorraine Warren described the first ghost as being the spirit of an Irish cook named Molly. According to Ms. Warren, she is not old, is quite domineering and is athletically inclined. She is not quite a lady. I get a feeling that she did not have a man in her life, and that if she had a husband, she would have completely dominated him. Ms. Warren went on to say that this cook served Major Sylvanus Thayer when he was the first superintendent at West Point. According to Lieutenant General William A. Knowlton, this apparition has been known to rumple bed linens by sitting on the beds. She is also said to have knocked wine bottles to the floor in the kitchen. Visitors to this home who have seen this ghost have claimed that while Molly is mischievous, she does not mean any harm, and is more playful than hurtful in nature. The other ghost who appears to reside in the superintendent's house is that of an African-American soldier named Greer. It is this apparition who is thought to be responsible for having moved items throughout the house. For example, when the former superintendent of the Coast Guard Academy and his wife stayed at the house as guests at Maxwell Mansion, they awoke to find the wallet of another guest lying between them in bed. The clairvoyant, Lorraine Warren, has described Greer as being tall and slender in a gray uniform. She claims that Greer was a soldier who carried the emotional burden of sadness and guilt because he had committed a heinous murder that he had never taken responsibility for in life. After having learned about this soldier, Lieutenant General Knowlton contacted the Academy's head librarian to request personnel information about a black soldier named Greer. An archivist was able to identify the apparition as being Private Lawrence Greer. According to the archivist,
Lawrence Greer was a private in Troop C, 9th Cavalry. He escaped from confinement at Fort Leavenworth in June of 1931 and was apprehended the following April near Albany, New York. He was brought to West Point as a military prisoner and was court-martialed for his escape and subsequent desertion. After having been found guilty of desertion, he was sentenced to 2.5 years of hard labor. This sentence was disapproved by the command of Major General Connor because the prisoner was judged insane at the time of his trial. We have no record of what happened to Private Greer after these events.
According to the archivist, there were no records to indicate why the private had deserted. There is also no record tying the private to any murder. Another ghost is said to haunt quarters 107B on Professor's Row, a section of West Point that has been set aside for academy instructors. The story goes that a professor once lived there with his wife during the 1920s. After his wife became fatally ill and bedridden, his mother-in-law came to care for her daughter and to take over her daughter's housekeeping responsibilities. To the wife's dismay and growing resentment, the professor and her mother fell in love. Although her deathbed wish was that her husband not wed another, her husband did precisely that after his wife had passed away. Shortly after his wife's death, he married his mother-in-law. According to one medium, the dead woman's anger over this broken promise has kept her spirit chained to the house. Shortly after this woman died, strange events began to occur within this house. A clock that had been frozen for years chimed to life. Items were thrown around the house. At night, the sound of something being dragged across the floor upstairs could be heard by people who were downstairs. Even more disturbing were the following events. In 1971, this house was occupied by a professor whose family included an 8-year-old daughter. On multiple occasions it was reported that the husband and wife would wake up in the middle of the night to find that their youngest daughter was having a conversation with someone who wasn't there. When asked who their daughter had been speaking to, the girl said that she had been talking to the lady. This experience is said to have occurred several times over the next few years. So what do you think? Did the little girl in the professor's home just have an overactive imagination? What about the cadet in room 4714? Did his report of a ghost stem from a nightmare? If this ghost was a nightmare, what happened to the cadets in the bureau? As for Lieutenant General William A. Knowlton, I wonder what events led him to call for a séance. Please share your thoughts in the comments below.
If you liked this video and would like to see more content, please click on the like and subscribe buttons.